Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today's story is one of the most frustrating family betrayals we've covered in a long time. Imagine being told by your own father that you need to start paying rent to live in your childhood home. Okay, fair enough. A lot of parents do that. Some people think it's actually a healthy practice, builds responsibility, gets you ready for the real world. I get it. There's an argument to be made. But then imagine finally deciding to move out, peacefully, responsibly, without drama, without vengeance, without making it weird. You just quietly start looking for apartments because you're a grown adult and you have every right to live wherever you choose. And suddenly, your dad completely loses his mind. Not because something terrible happened, not because you did anything wrong, but because the rent was never really about teaching you responsibility. It was never about preparing you for independence. It was never even really about the money. It was about control. And the second this man realized he couldn't control his daughter anymore, the second she calmly called his bluff and said, "Okay, then I'll leave," he turned the entire family against her over night, called her ungrateful, called her selfish, went through her private emails, punched furniture, and then sent a text message to every aunt, uncle, cousin, and grandmother in the extended family to make sure she walked into every future family gathering feeling like the villain. This one gets ugly, so let's get into it. I want you to pay very close attention to the details here, because this story is a masterclass in recognizing how certain types of parents use money specifically, the money they charge their own children as a mechanism for emotional leverage. And once you see the pattern, you will see it everywhere. So the original poster is a 24-year-old woman. We'll call her Mia, because she deserves a name. Mia writes, "I'm a 24-year-old woman, and up until recently, I lived with my dad and stepmom. For context, my parents divorced when I was 11 after my dad cheated on my mom with the woman who is now my stepmother. My relationship with him has always been complicated, not horrible, not completely toxic, but complicated. And that detail right there, the fact that her dad left her mom for the stepmom, is something we need to hold on to because it matters later a lot," she continues. "After college, I moved back home because rent prices in my city are insane, and my dad told me it would help me save money while I got established in my career. At first, things were honestly fine. I stayed out of the way, cleaned up after myself, bought my own groceries most of the time, and worked full-time at a marketing firm downtown. So let's picture this. Mia is doing everything right. She's working full-time. She's self-sufficient with food. She's clean. She's respectful. She's not throwing parties or wrecking the place. By all objective measures, she's a model roommate. Not just a good daughter, a literally good roommate. Then, about 8 months in, her dad sits her down at the kitchen table for what she describes as the big life lesson conversation. He literally folded his hands together and said, 'You're an adult now. Adults contribute.' And here's where Mia impresses me immediately, because her reaction was not to throw a fit. She didn't argue. She agreed immediately. She said, 'Okay, how much?' He said $700 a month. Now, that's a little steep when you're sharing a bathroom with a teenage half-es. Sibling in your old childhood bedroom surrounded by your middle school trophies. But again, Mia's not entitled. She understood the logic. Apartments in her city were way more expensive. 700 was still a discount. So she agreed, paid it on time, and life moved on for about 5 minutes. Because almost immediately, things started shifting in ways that felt hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Let me describe this phase of the story the way Mia describes it, because the details here are really important. At first, it was small things. The stepmom started leaving sticky notes around the house. Little passive-aggressive reminders. Please wipe down counters. Don't leave laundry in washer. Take trash out when full. And listen on their own. Those sticky notes are almost nothing. Annoying, maybe. A little presumptuous. But whatever. Except here's the thing. Mia already did all of those things. She already cleaned the counters. She already moved her laundry. She already took the trash out. So the notes weren't instructions for things she was failing to do. They were reminders that someone was watching, evaluating, keeping a running tally. Her dad started getting critical about her schedule. If she came home late from work, he'd ask where she was. Not in a warm, "Hey, I was worried about you" way. In a suspicious, interrogating way. If she ordered takeout, He'd make comments about wasting money, despite the fact that she was spending her own money, that she'd already paid rent, and that her personal food budget was none of his business. If she spent weekends with friends, he'd sarcastically mutter things like, "Must be nice to have that kind of free time." And then one night, Mia came home around 11 p.m. after a co-worker's birthday dinner. Normal, unremarkable. A 24-year-old woman being a 24-year-old woman. And her dad was waiting in the living room with his arms crossed. She froze in the doorway because the whole scene felt surreal. She said it felt like walking into a situation meant for a teenager who'd missed curfew, except she was a full-grown adult who had work in the morning and had already paid that month's rent and had not done a single thing wrong. He looked at her and said, "Do you think this is a hotel?" She actually laughed because she thought he had to be joking. The whole situation seemed almost too cartoonishly parental to be real. He wasn't joking. He lectured her about respect and communication and how people who live under his roof should let him know when they're coming home late. She said, "Dad, I'm 24." And he snapped, "Then act like it. Now stop. I need you to freeze on that exchange for a second, because what just happened?" Mia's father told her to act like an adult, meaning pay rent, be financially responsible, contribute, but then also demanded she check in about her comings and goings like a teenager with a curfew. She cannot simultaneously be adult enough to owe him $700 a month and also young enough to need his permission to be out past 10 p.m. on a Friday. Those two things cannot coexist. Except in the mind of a controlling parent, they absolutely can, because they aren't actually operating on logic. They're operating on power. And Mia says this was the exact moment something emotionally shifted for her, because she finally understood clearly. Without doubt, she was paying to be treated like a misbehaving child. Over the next few months, the hypercriticism spread to everything. The therm. Ostat. She liked it slightly cooler. He wanted it warmer. Apparently, her preferences on temperature in the house she was paying to live in were a form of disrespect. The lights. If she left a room and forgot to turn off a light, he'd make a comment loud enough for her to hear from the next room. How long she showered. Her stepmom actually started timing her showers. That happened. She timed them, what food she kept in the fridge. Apparently, having her own section of the refrigerator with foods he didn't recognize was somehow an imposition. And then there's the part of the story that reveals the deepest, most uncomfortable truth about this whole situation. How often she visited her mom. Every single time Mia spent time with her mother, which was normal, healthy, and completely her right, her father would become passive-aggressive afterward. He'd say things like, "Must be nice over there," or "I'm sure your mother tells you I'm the villain," or the absolute gold standard of divorced parent guilt trips. One day you'll understand who actually sacrificed for you. Now, let's unpack that. This man cheated on Mia's mother. He left. He built a new household with a new woman. Now he's sitting in that new household, charging his daughter rent, and using every visit she makes to her original home to the mother who didn't leave as an opportunity to compete, to guilt, to remind her of some imaginary debt. That's not a father enforcing reasonable house rules. That's a man who feels guilty about the past and is using his daughter's presence in his home as a way to constantly tilt the scoreboard back in his direction. He wants to be the good guy. He needs to be the good guy. And every time Mia walks through her mom's front door, it threatens that narrative. Mia says she still tried to keep the peace through all of this. Culturally and emotionally, she'd been raised to respect her father. She told herself he was stressed. She told herself money was tight. She told herself she might be overreacting. She kept paying rent. She kept swallowing her frustration. She kept trying. Until the dinner conversation. And this is where everything detonates. One night during dinner, Mia's dad casually asked how much money she currently had in savings. She immediately felt uncomfortable, and rightly so, because that is not a casual question. That is surveillance. See, she kind of laughed it off and said, "Enough." But he kept pushing. He wanted actual numbers. Her stepmom joined in with a softer pressure tactic, saying things like, "We just want to make sure you're planning responsibly," which is the polite way of saying, "We want to know how much money you have so we can recalibrate what we're owed." Mia eventually told them she'd saved around $22,000 since moving back home. The entire room went cold. Her dad put his fork down and stared at her. Then he said, 22,000? And you're still here. Now, that comment alone. What does that even mean? She's still here because she was following the plan: save money, get established, eventually move out. That's what she was doing. The plan worked. She saved $22,000. That's a success story. That's supposed to be the goal. But to her dad, apparently, that success was an accusation. She told him she was saving for a down payment eventually. A perfectly reasonable, responsible, adult explanation for why a person saving money might not have immediately spent it. And then he said the thing she says she'll never forget. He said, if you can save that kind of money, your rent should be higher. She thought he was joking. He wasn't. He started explaining that $700 was apparently too generous, given current housing costs. He said he'd been doing research. He said the market had changed. And then he proposed with complete seriousness that her rent should increase to $1,200 a month, starting the following month. $1,200 to sleep in her childhood bedroom. Let me make sure we all understand what just happened here. For months, Mia has been paying rent. She has been living according to the structure her father set. She's been a good tenant, a cooperative family member, a financially responsible adult. She saved money, which is what you're supposed to do when you pay reduced rent while living with family. That's literally the entire point of the arrangement, and her father's response to discovering that she succeeded at the plan he created. Great, now I want more. That is not a life lesson. That is extraction. And the most revealing part, the thing that rips the teaching responsibility mask completely off, is that the number he quoted was almost identical to what she'd eventually find at an actual apartment on the open market, which means he wasn't offering her a subsidized arrangement anymore. He was charging her market rate for her childhood bedroom, with curfews, with monitored showers, with sticky notes and cross arms and passive-aggressive comments about her mother. If she was going to pay $1,200 a month, she might as well live somewhere she had actual freedom, actual privacy, actual autonomy. Somewhere the landlord couldn't go through her emails or wait up for her in the dark. And when she said exactly that, if I'm paying $1,200, I might as well just move out, something in her father cracked, not softened, cracked. His face changed instantly, like she had said something violent. He said, so that's your solution? Run away? And that word, run away, is so telling. Because adults don't run away. Children run away. He's already framing her logical, legal, completely reasonable decision to exercise her rights as an adult human as an act of juvenile rebellion. She said she wasn't running away. She was being practical. He accused her of being ungrateful. The stepmom chimed in with, your disrespect in the family. And then Mia quietly, clearly, with the precision of someone who has been swallowing things for way too long, said, you're treating me like a tenant when it benefits you and a child when it benefits you. Dead silence. Her father stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. He pointed at her and said, if you don't like the rules here, leave. So she did. Here's something I've noticed about controlling people. They love ultimatums they don't actually expect anyone to accept. Fine, leave. Go ahead and go. See how the real world treats you. These things get said with absolute certainty that the other person will flinch, will backpedal, will apologize and shrink and say, no, I don't want to leave. I'm sorry. Let's forget this. Because the ultimatum is a bluff. It's a power move designed to demonstrate dominance. The expected outcome is compliance. The person issues the ultimatum, the other person backs down, and the hierarchy is restored. What these people are completely unprepared for is the moment their target simply says, okay, not dramatically, just quietly. Okay, I'll go. Because that response exposes the bluff eye. T demonstrates that the ultimatum had no teeth. It shows that the person who issued it had no actual leverage. They were counting entirely on fear and guilt and obligation to do the work. And when Mia said, okay, she diffused all three. So the next morning, she started apartment hunting. She says she did it quietly and carefully because she still genuinely hoped things would calm down. She still hoped maybe her dad would walk back the rent increase, or apologize for the late-night confrontation, or acknowledge that he had overreacted. She was giving him space to be a person, to recalibrate. She didn't tell extended family. She didn't vent publicly. She didn't weaponize the situation. She just started preparing to exercise her rights, and he got worse. Here is something that I think is deeply psychologically fascinating about this next phase. Mia describes her father becoming weirdly hostile after the fight. Not guilty, not apologetic, hostile. He started treating her like a ghost. If she walked into the kitchen, he'd leave. If she tried to make conversation, he responded in single syllables. Her stepmom essentially stopped speaking to her altogether. And what'd this be? Behavior tells us is that he knew, on some level, that he'd gone too far. He knew the demand for $1,200 was unreasonable. He knew the ultimatum was a mistake. He knew Mia had called his bluff correctly and that she was now, for the first time in this dynamic, holding all the cards. But instead of acknowledging that, instead of having the emotional maturity to walk something back, he doubled down on the coldness. Because admitting fault would require vulnerability. And vulnerability would require giving up control. And for this particular type of person, control is everything. Then came the moment that, in my opinion, is the single most alarming thing in this entire story. One Saturday morning, Mia left her laptop open on her desk while she jumped in the shower. When she came back, her dad was sitting on the edge of her bed, holding printed apartment listings that had come from her email. He'd gone through her inbox, her private personal email account, without permission, without warning, without any pretense of an emergency or a misunderstanding. He had deliberately accessed her private communications and printed out evidence of her plans so he could confront her with them. She asked what he was doing. He got angry. He said, "So you've been secretly planning to leave?" She said yes, because he literally told her to. And instead of having any self-awareness about the fact that he had just committed a significant violation of her privacy, he launched into a speech about loyalty and family and how kids today abandon their parents the second things get hard. She said, "Dad, you raised me to become independent." And he laughed, not warmly, bitterly, like she had said something stupid. He said, "Independent doesn't mean selfish." Let that sentence sit for a moment. Independent doesn't mean selfish. What he means, translated out of his emotional language, is this: you are allowed to be independent as long as your independence doesn't inconvenience me. You are allowed to grow up as long as growing up doesn't mean growing away from me. You are allowed to be an adult as long as being an adult still involves you living here and paying me money and checking in about your plans and absorbing my guilt and serving as my ongoing proof that I am actually a good father. The moment you try to exercise independence in a way that removes you from my orbit, that's when it becomes selfish. That's the whole trap, and now you can see it completely. Mia found an apartment with a coworker she trusted. Reasonable rent. Better commute. No sticky notes. No crossed arms in the living room at 11 p.m. She said signing the lease felt like she could breathe for the first time in months. She gave her dad 2 weeks' notice because she was still trying to do everything respectfully. She wanted to leave well. She wanted to do right by the situation even if the situation hadn't done right by her. She told him her move-out date. He stared at her for a long moment and said, "You're really doing this?" She said yes. He asked how much the new apartment cost. When she told him, he got furious because it was only slightly more than what he'd wanted to charge her. Which means, and this hit her in real time, he hadn't been trying to prepare her for market rate rent by showing her what it would look like. He had genuinely expected her to pay him nearly what she could pay a real landlord in exchange for her childhood bedroom and a household where she had zero autonomy and unlimited monitoring. And then he said the line that I think finally crystallized everything for her. He said, "So you'd rather pay strangers than help your own family?" There it is. Pay strangers. As in, paying him was helping the family. As in, her rent money wasn't just covering expenses, it had been absorbed into their household budget. They had planned around it. They had built their monthly spending on the assumption that Mia's money was theirs, which means this was never, not for a single month, about Mia's financial development. It was about supplementing their household income. And when she found a way to become financially stable enough to leave, the response wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was fury. Because the income stream was drying up, things escalated dramatically from there. Her stepmom became openly hostile. Snide comments every day. Some people forget who supported them. Don't come crawling back when reality hits. Classic destabilization tactics, trying to plant seeds of doubt, trying to make Mia feel like she was making a mistake, trying to make independence feel scary rather than earned. Her dad got more aggressive. He demanded to know exactly where she was moving, not out of fatherly concern, something that felt much more like surveillance. Mia, who by this point was legitimately uncomfortable in her own home, refused to give him her new address. He punched the kitchen counter, not her, but the message was the same. That is an act of intimidation. That is what a person does when they are trying to make the air feel dangerous without leaving marks. It's the physical vocabulary of someone who wants you to be afraid. Mia started staying at her co-worker's place until move-in day. The actual move happened without incident. Her dad wasn't home, which she suspects was either intentional avoidance or a last-ditch attempt to make her feel guilty by being absent. She moved her things out over the course of a Saturday. Her mom helped. A couple of friends helped. She says it was almost weirdly peaceful, like stepping out of a storm into a quiet afternoon. And then her phone started going off. Text messages from her aunt, from her grandmother, from cousins she hadn't spoken to in months. All of them variations on the same theme. How could you do this to your father? He's heartbroken. He's done so much for you. You're being selfish. You're being cruel. You're abandoning your family. Her dad had called everyone. In the hours after she moved out, he got on the phone or maybe sent a group message, "We don't know," and told the entire extended family his version of events, which, based on the responses Mia was getting, apparently did not include the raised rent demand or the violated email privacy or the waiting in the dark confrontations or the counterpunching or any of the actual reasons she had left. What it apparently did include was a narrative of an ungrateful, the daughter who had been generously housed and lovingly supported, and who had repaid that generosity by coldly walking out the moment she had enough money in the bank. And now every single family member Mia has was looking at her through that lens, without ever having heard her side. Let me take a moment here to talk about what this tactic is, because it has a name, and understanding it is genuinely important. What Mia's father did is called preemptive narrative control. It's a manipulation strategy where someone senses they are about to lose a conflict emotionally, morally, or practically, and moves first to shape how that conflict will be perceived by the surrounding community. The goal is to poison the well before the other person can speak, to make sure that by the time the target of the manipulation tries to explain themselves, everyone has already heard the official story. It's particularly effective in family systems because families operate on loyalty dynamics. When grandma hears that her son is devastated by his daughter abandoning him, she feels a deep sense of loss and heartache. She doesn't immediately start asking critical questions about rent negotiations and emotional control. She feels protective of her son and judgmental of his daughter. That's a normal human response. It's not her fault, but it's also exactly what Mia's father was counting on. The really insidious part of this tactic is that it puts the victim in an impossible position. If Mia says nothing, the narrative stands unchallenged and she's the villain. If she tries to defend herself, she looks defensive, and her attempts to explain are easily reframed as making excuses or attacking a grieving father. Either way, she loses, unless she chooses a third option, and we'll get to that. Mia posted her story to one of the major relationship advice communities, and the response was enormous. The comment section filled up within hours, thousands of people weighing in, and the consensus was overwhelming. Not that Mia was perfect, because no one's perfect, but that the pattern of behavior her father had exhibited was recognizable, documented, and had a name. Several people with backgrounds in psychology pointed out that the dynamic Mia was describing charging rent as a mechanism for control rather than genuine financial exchange, is actually a well-documented pattern in households with certain types of controlling parents. The money becomes a prop. It's not really about the money itself. It's about what the money transaction represents, which is the formalization of the parent's authority over the child's life. Here's how it works. When you charge your adult child rent, you create a pseudo-landlord relationship, but you're also their parent. So in their minds, they've created a situation where they have the authority of a landlord and the authority of a parent simultaneously. They can invoke whichever one is more convenient at any given moment. When you want to control their behavior, curfews, schedules, food, temperature, Visitors, you invoke the parent card. My house, my rules, I'm your father. When you want to extract money, and more importantly, when you want to prevent them from saving enough to leave you, invoke the landlord card. You're an adult, adults contribute, market rates exist. It's a trapdoor in both directions. There's no position Mia could have occupied that would have satisfied both simultaneously, because they're designed not to be satisfiable. The only escape is the one she found. Walk out. A commenter with the username Childhood Home Escape shared something that got thousands. D's of upvotes, and I want to share the gist of it here because it reframed the whole story in a way I found genuinely clarifying. This person said something like, "The thing people miss is that controlling parents don't actually want their kids to be ready for the world. They say they do. They perform the language of wanting their kids to be independent and capable and successful. But what they actually want, what feeds the deepest emotional need, is to be needed. And an adult child who is capable, self-sufficient, and financially stable doesn't need you in the way you want to be needed. So unconsciously, sometimes consciously, these parents undermine the very independence they claim to be building. They create obstacles, they drain savings, they raise rent, they maintain environments that are uncomfortable enough that the child is always somewhat destabilized, always a little off balance, always just dependent enough to stay. And when the child finally escapes in spite of all of it, it's not experienced as success, it's experienced as betrayal, because the goal was never actually independence. It was proximity. Mia posted an update about 3 weeks after the original story. And this update is where the story gets both worse and better simultaneously, which is a very specific emotional experience that I think a lot of you are going to recognize. She writes, "I've had 3 weeks in my new apartment, and I cannot describe how different I feel, like my brain has quieted down in a way I didn't even realize it needed to. I wake up in the morning and there's just silence and no one is watching me, and I can eat whatever I want and come home whenever I want, and no one is sitting in the dark waiting for me. I didn't know how much tension I'd been carrying until I put it down." That paragraph. Sit with it, because that description, brain quieting, tension lifting, not realizing how much you were carrying until it was gone, is a description of leaving a chronically stressful environment. That's not a description of moving out of a dad's house. That's a description of leaving somewhere that was making her sick. She continues, "The family stuff is hard. My aunt sent me a very long message about family loyalty and how much my father has sacrificed. My grandmother cried when we spoke on the phone, which was awful. A cousin told me I was breaking my dad's heart. One of them asked me a single question about my experience. They had all already decided. This part is heartbreaking in a very specific way, because Mia's support network, the aunts and grandmothers and cousins who should, in theory, be the people who show up for her, had been prepositioned against her before she could say a single word, and every one of them was expressing real emotion, real concern, real grief, on behalf of the wrong person. But then she says something that I found genuinely mature. I've decided I'm not going to fight the narrative. I'm not going to call everyone and give them my side and try to win some kind of family court case. I don't want to put other people in the middle. And honestly, I'm not sure it would change anything. People who need to believe a story will believe it. What I can do is live well. Call the people who reach out with genuine curiosity rather than preloaded judgment. Keep the door open without walking into the fire." You guys, that's wisdom. Actual wisdom. From someone 24 years old who just moved out of a difficult family home 3 weeks ago. She also addressed the question that a lot of commenters had asked, which was whether, she felt guilty. And she said something I want to read very carefully, because it captures something true about this kind of family dynamic. She said, "I've thought about that a lot. And yes, there are moments of guilt. He's my dad. It's complicated with the divorce and the history and everything. I don't think he's a monster. I think he's a person with a lot of unresolved stuff, probably guilt about the affair, probably insecurity about his role, probably some genuine financial stress I'm not fully aware of. I have compassion for that. But compassion doesn't mean I have to be available to absorb it at the cost of my own life. I can feel sad about his pain without making myself smaller to manage it." Say that again. "I can feel sad about his pain without making myself smaller to manage it." That line is going to live in my head for a long time. A second update came about 2 months later, and this one is interesting because things had shifted again, in a direction no one quite expected. Mia's half-brother, the teenage kid from her dad's current marriage, had apparently started texting her independently. He was 15 at the time of all of this, and she says he hadn't really been involved in the conflict directly since he was mostly at his mom's house on weekends, but apparently he had witnessed some of it, more than people knew, and now, 2 months later, he was reaching out to Mia kind of regularly. She writes, "He texted me asking if he could come over and see the new place. I said of course. He came last Sunday. We ordered pizza and watched movies. He didn't say much about Dad at first, but toward the end of the night, he said, 'I think what he did wasn't fair.' Just like that. A 15-year-old? I almost cried. He said he'd heard some of the arguments. He said Dad talks about me a lot, not kindly, and that it bothers him. I didn't want to put him in the middle, so I just said thank you for saying that and left it there. But it meant something." This part of the update matters for a few reasons. 1. The half-brother independently sought Mia out. She didn't recruit him. She didn't ask him to take sides. He came to her. That tells you something about the environment in that house right now. 2. He said their father talks about Mia frequently and not kindly, which tells you that the narrative hasn't settled into closure, it's still active. He's sick. I'll be talking about it. He's still processing it. He's still, on some level, working through the loss of control that her departure represented. 3. A 15-year-old calling something unfair, unprompted, is meaningful. Kids that age are not usually inclined to criticize their parents to their older siblings unless what they observed was significant enough to stick. And 4. Mia's response accepting the acknowledgement without weaponizing it, refusing to recruit her little brother into a family war shows exactly the kind of person she is. Exactly the kind of person who deserved so much better than what she got in that house. Now let's talk about the comment debate that erupted in the thread, because it's genuinely interesting and worth spending time on. There was a significant contingent of commenters who took something close to a devil's advocate position. And while I don't agree with most of their conclusions, I think their arguments deserve to be engaged with seriously because some of them raised real points. The argument went roughly like this. Charging adult children rent is a normal and healthy practice in many cultures. $700 was genuinely below market rate. Mia lived there for what sounds like well over a year. The dad may have had legitimate financial reasons for wanting to raise the rent that we're not seeing. And we're only hearing one side of the story. Okay, fair points. Let me engage with them. Yes, charging adult children rent is normal in many cultures and can be genuinely healthy. But charging rent is not the problem Mia described. The problem was the combination of charging rent and maintaining behavioral control. You can charge reasonable rent. You can also maintain a respectful household. The issue arises when you charge rent as a formal adult transaction while simultaneously treating the paying adult like a teenager who needs permission to come home late. The transaction creates an implicit social contract. Once you formalize the financial exchange, you've altered the relationship. Both parties need to adjust. Yes, $700 was below market rate, but it was also for a childhood bedroom in a shared home with emotional labor requirements that a standard landlord would never impose. And more importantly, the fact that it was below market rate was presented as a benefit and a gift. If the dad wanted market rate, he should have said market rate from the beginning. Changing the terms retroactively, especially after discovering his tenant had saved money specifically as a result of the agreed-upon arrangement, is not a reasonable landlord move. It's punitive. Yes, we only have Mia's side, but the specific details she provides, the printed emails, the furniture punching, the family campaign, are the kinds of details that are either true or represent a level of fabrication that would itself be deeply troubling. And across thousands of comments, the pattern she described was recognized immediately and repeatedly by people with lived experience in similar dynamics. The fingerprint of this kind of household is distinctive. And finally, yes, parents can have legitimate financial stress we don't know about. But legitimate financial stress doesn't justify going through your adult child's private emails. Legitimate financial stress doesn't justify intimidation tactics. If dad needed more money, dad could have had a calm conversation about that. The way this conversation went was not a calm conversation about finances. The majority of commenters landed in the same place. Mia did everything right. A. And then she kept doing everything right even when doing everything right got harder. There's one more piece of this story I want to address before we wrap up, and it's the question that I think sits quietly underneath the whole thing. What is this actually about? Not on the surface, not the rent and the rules and the sticky notes. What is the deep thing, the real wound? I think this is about a man who made a choice 14 years ago, a choice to leave his marriage, to hurt his daughter's mother, to build a new life with a new woman, and who has never fully reckoned with what that cost his daughter emotionally, who has never looked directly at the fact that his first family experienced his choice as a loss, and that his daughter, specifically, grew up navigating the complicated emotional terrain of loving a father who chose to leave. And I think somewhere in the dynamic of Mia living in his house, paying rent, being present somewhere in that arrangement, he found a kind of relief. A narrative he could tell himself. She's here. She chose to be here. Which means she's forgiven me. Which means we're okay. And when she left, when she exercised her right as an adult to live her WN life in her own space, something in that narrative broke. Because if she was truly, fully, freely choosing, she chose to go somewhere else. That's not really about $700. That's not really about $1,200. That's about a man who has been using proximity as a proxy for forgiveness, and who discovered that the forgiveness he thought he had was actually just geography. And when the geography changed, he panicked, he grieved, he struck out, he called the family, he punched the counter. He went through her emails, looking for evidence that she had been planning this, as if the planning itself was the betrayal, as if her having a private interior life that included the possibility of leaving was somehow proof that she'd never really been there at all. That's not parenting. That's someone terrified of what her absence means about who he is. Mia's most recent update, about 4 months after she first moved out, is brief, but it's the one that matters most. She writes, "Things have been mostly quiet. My dad tried to reach out once via text message. It was short. He said he hoped I was well and that the door was always open. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with it for about a week. Then I wrote back something short, said I appreciated him saying that and that I needed more time. He didn't respond after that, which honestly felt like progress, like maybe he understood. My grandmother and I have been talking more. She actually apologized for the initial message she sent and said she hadn't had the full picture. That meant a lot. My half-brother came over again last weekend. We're developing something that feels like a real relationship independent of all the adult stuff. I'm grateful for that. My apartment is good. My job is good. I feel like myself again. Whatever that means, that's what I feel. Whatever that means, that's what she feels." I keep coming back to that sentence because feeling like yourself again after leaving a controlling family dynamic is this strange, quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic moment where you raise your arms in victory. It's more like one morning you make coffee and you realize you're not bracing for anything. You're just making coffee. And the absence of the bracing, the absence of that low-level, constant readiness for criticism or surveillance or guilt, that absence, starts to feel like yourself. But it's real. So what do we take from all of this? If you are an adult child living at home with parents who are conflating rent payments with behavioral control, Mia's story is a roadmap. Not a roadmap for conflict, she avoided conflict at every turn, but a roadmap for clarity. Know what the transaction actually is. Know what you're entitled to within it. Know when the terms have changed. And know that "then leave" is a complete sentence, not an invitation to negotiate. If you are a parent in this situation, and some of you are, and I say this with genuine compassion, rather than judgment, examine what you actually want from your adult child living with you. Be honest with yourself. If the rent money has been folded into your monthly budget in a way that means you'd struggle without it, that's a conversation worth having openly rather than covertly. If you're charging rent partly because you want to maintain authority over someone who is no longer a dependent child, that's something worth examining with a therapist rather than a lease agreement. Because here's the truth. The goal of parenting, the whole point, the entire long arc of the project is to raise a person who can live fully and freely without you, who has internalized enough of what you taught them to navigate the world on their own terms, who can leave If your child leaving feels like betrayal, something in the project went sideways somewhere. That doesn't necessarily make you a villain. People are complicated. Guilt is complicated. Love is complicated. But it does mean there's work to do that isn't your child's responsibility. Mia did the work. She kept doing the work even when no one was watching and no one was helping and the whole family had been turned against her. She packed her things and she moved and she kept the door open and she was kind to her little brother and she waited a week before responding to a difficult text message. That's not running away. That's growing up. And at 24 years old, having navigated all of that with the grace and clarity she showed, she's going to be absolutely fine. More than fine, okay? That's going to do it for today's video. If this story hit close to home in any way, if you recognize something in the dynamics here, whether from Mia's side or from somewhere else, drop it in the comments below. I always love hearing from you. And the conversations in the comments section on videos like this tend to be some of the most honest and meaningful ones we have on this channel. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe if you want to see more stories like this. We drop new videos every week, and we cover everything from relationship drama to workplace chaos to family dynamics that make your jaw hit the floor. And if you know someone who would find this story helpful, not just entertaining, but genuinely useful, please share it. Sometimes people need to hear that what they're experiencing has a name and a pattern and an exit. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.